Hey, it's 6.1, step 2. We're talking about formalism in this video. Our question to help us focus is, how important is formalism as a literary lens when writing a guided literary analysis? So let's do some notes here. First of all, formalism is the dominant critical movement in literature and art in the middle decades of the 20th century. It was a response to what came before it, like most movements, and at the time in 1941 it was coined the new criticism because it was something new and different. And new critics believed the structure and meaning of the text were intimately connected and should not be analyzed separately. In order to bring the focus of literary studies back to analysis of text, they aim to exclude the reader's response, the author's intention, historical and cultural contexts, and moralistic bias from their analysis. So it's a literary theory that favors the form of a text and that form's relationship to what the text is about, or the text's content, over context. The movement got its name from John Crow Ransom's 1941 book called The New Criticism. And this book explained how literary analysis should be focused on understanding the literary work per se. By or in itself, intrinsically. So the textual object itself is what we study, not the things that surround it or that are where the text came from. Those things aren't important. They just aren't important anymore. So the literary text is the object of study, not the author, not any kind of context. Not philosophies that the author believed in or that were popular in the time period. Author's intention is actually irrelevant according to formalism. It simply doesn't matter what the author intended for the reader to feel or think or understand. Instead, it's what is there in the text that is important. Historical and cultural contexts are not a focus, and so we don't spend time looking at that when we're analyzing with the formalist lens. Not that things happen in a vacuum, but just that those things that can't be found inside the text are not as important. And moralistic and philosophical ideas are minimized. Doesn't matter so much what the poet stood for. What matters instead are what images are used inside this text. So formalism focuses on the relationship between elements in the text and the patterns that are created, like the relationship between similar words or how different stanzas work in relation to each other. Whoops, JK. The interplay of sound devices, the sequence and patterns of dialogue or actions or descriptions in an excerpt. All of these elements are what formalists call the external form. Okay, so the external form are the literal pieces that a reader can pick out and describe. And we call those authorial choices, examples of dits, literary features. Those are all the pieces that we can analyze and pick apart and say, this is something that we see happening in the text. Formalists also use the phrase organic form. Organic form is actually what the piece is about. It's the content of the text. The elements in the text or external form are only important if it can be connected to this organic form. In other words, if you find something interesting in a text, but you can't figure out how it connects to what the text is about. You don't see it creating a pattern at all. You just see this one random thing. It's not important then. We have to see how these things work together as a whole in order to create meaning. And so oftentimes we talk about how the external form mirrors content. How are the elements of the text similar to what the text is about? For example, maybe the text is about something that is very chaotic and hard to understand and scary. It might be that the actual way the piece is structured, like if it's a poem, is a bit chaotic and hard to understand. Maybe lines are broken at unusual places. They seem random in terms of their length. Maybe there are other aspects that don't seem to totally make sense. That in itself then mirrors what the piece is about. If the piece itself is chaotic and doesn't make a lot of sense initially. Okay, so those are the kinds of things we're looking at when we look at formalism and the paper 1 exam. All right, let me give you a couple analogies to help you better understand what the heck I'm talking about, okay? Here's the first one. This analogy is comparing the literary text to an organism, all right? So the words, the images, and how the sentences and lines in poetry are structured are like organisms that interact with each other, building on each other to create an organic unity. One way to think of this is thinking of your creation or understanding of meaning from the text as a web, okay? This dude, Richard Hood, is a smart guy who does a lot of work for IB, has published a lot of books for them, and I got a chance to work with him once long ago. He came up with this analogy, and back in the day, we used to have to write about all of these different literary elements or formal or technical aspects when we wrote a paper 1. They've since changed paper 1, so now paper 1 has a guiding question that asks you about just one of these literary elements. But it's still an important idea to think about, the fact that the different pieces that you can pick out, like the words, the images, the way the lines are constructed, work together. Organic unity is emphasized in formalism, so all the bits and pieces, the literary devices, the wordplay, the figurative language, the imagery, the unusual word choices that you can find in a literary text build and complement each other. They help each other like an organic being. And the literary text is seen not as made up of isolated images or symbols or parts, but as an organic whole. And so if you take a look at Hood's different elements, he mentions punctuation, sensory detail, which he isolates from imagery in comparative imagery. Repetition, stanza line breaks, mood, atmosphere, tone, diction, and then classical references, allusions. So these are all some different aspects that are technical, formal elements in literature that we can look for in paper 1. And they work together to point us towards one larger meaning. Another analogy for you is to imagine the literary text as a room you've never seen before. Somehow you have been transported into this room. You've never been there. You don't know where you are or what the purpose or meaning of the room is. And so you look around at the different elements that you can find in that room. You'll see that, you know, there's a chair and a table. There's some shelves and plants. Paintings seem to have aesthetic purposes. There is a vista out the window. It looks like it's water of some kind. Maybe it's an ocean. There also might be objects, or there, in this picture anyway, there are objects that might be used as tools, like the pens and pencils and the books, and so forth. The blanket too here, maybe in the basket. There's no chronological, logical way, so those are two separate things, logical or chronological way to make sense of this room. But when you're looking at all of the different pieces put together, then you see that these bits and pieces give you an organic understanding or a bigger picture, what formalists call an organic unity. And when looking at them all together, you can determine the larger reason or meaning for the room. You don't just isolate one chair and say, aha, the chair is green, therefore this room is all about greed, right? Oftentimes, and this is the biggest pitfall in paper ones, students will latch onto one thing they find and attach to it a symbolic meaning, and then argue that that is what the meaning of the poem is. Similarly, like let's say you were to just latch on to that ocean. If you just focused on the vista, the view from inside this room and the ocean outside, you would be missing everything that is happening inside the room. And so you'd miss what the room is actually for. It's not used just to look at water, right? It has all of these other things that are happening in it as well. And so it's really important not to isolate one particular image, one particular thing that you might think is a symbol, and then to equate it to something that you see connecting to this symbol and go for that meaning. Instead, you have to look at how all the different images or all the different aspects of whatever technical element you're looking at work together to create meaning for you as someone new entering this room, trying to understand what its purpose is. All right, so what is formalism? It's finding meaning through patterns and structures. It is not looking at context. So it doesn't matter who the poet is, unless IB tells us. If they give us a hint, then we can use that. But otherwise, we don't spend time looking at that. We don't spend too much time thinking about when it was written and what was going on historically at that time period. Instead, we're looking at the text, just those words on the page, not really where they came from, but how elements of formal and technical literary aspects work together to create meaning. Okay, so one way to help us be able to do this so that we can understand, like, what is it that I can say about the text is to use a technique called SCASI. And these questions are all written down in the next step in your packet, so you don't actually have to write them down. So write whatever you want in the blank spot there. You can write other stuff that I'm saying. But SCASI is a technique to help you tackle a new piece of text like a formalist, because it first of all helps us understand the literal meaning of a poem or a short piece of text. And this is a step that a lot of students miss. They instead look for things that might have symbolic meaning, and they forget that we have to make sense of the facts. What is in the room? What are we given? What can we use to help us understand where we are? So we start with the literal stuff, and that is the first three aspects: setting, characters, and action. Everything happens somewhere. Sometimes settings are not literal, especially in poems. They might just be hinted at or implied, but you can still look at the situation of the piece. What kind of moment are we set in? What is the predicament we find ourselves in, if there isn't a clear setting? Characters are another thing that we can always find in poetry and short pieces of text. If there aren't any characters described, there's at least the character who is speaking. And if it's poetry, that character is the speaker. If it's prose, that character is the narrator. If it's drama, those characters are characters who are speaking. And we might have some stage directions that are included in drama that are provided by the playwright. So characters are another thing we can look at. Then we have to look at, like, what is happening? Is there any interaction between characters? Or is it just the speaker detailing the differences between two groups of people, or how he wishes fall wouldn't come? Like, what is actually happening? What is, if anything, is going on? All right, so these are dealing with the literal aspects, things that can be proven to be true. And it's really important when you tackle a new piece of text that you spend some time with SC and A. You're not going to write about it probably directly in your literary guided analysis, but it will come up indirectly, and it will show that you have a very good understanding of the text, and it will allow you to analyze, evaluate, and interpret. So without it, there's not much hope that you're going to analyze, evaluate, and interpret. All right, we also have style. Style is when we get to the dits, right? The stuff we were just talking about, the literary aspects. And so you're luckily going to be given a guiding question that's going to help you look at a particular aspect of style. And then also your guiding question may hint at ideas, and this is the content, the organic form of the piece. And so oftentimes the guiding question will say, like, what is the imagery saying about love? And we know right then that we're given something about style and something about ideas. So look for help for style and ideas in the guiding question. And for this next activity, it's a should do, you should take a look at the poem that comes up. Let me take a look here. It is Late Love, okay? And try the SCASI technique with Late Love, and then read the student example paper that follows and grade it according to the rubric. All right, thanks.